Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning. Got my notice out a little bit early today. Uh, anyway, how are you?
Oh, soaked. It's been raining almost continuously for almost 48 hours.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
And how's work going for you?
I haven't been at my table in 9 days.
Oh my gosh. Hello, Art. Nice to see you. Um, 9 days. That's not good.
I've been working on some teaching modules I'm putting together for winter stuff. So
Uh-huh.
I'm just playing the back end admin stuff.
Yeah, well, that sounds right. Next weekend I have to do my quarterly reports on my kids. So
Right.
uh,
Yeah, I figure
it's
I always keep the same schedule. Whether I'm at my table or at my desk.
mhm,
So it's that way you don't lose momentum. You just
very
play
wise.
play a game a different spot.
Yeah. Oh, what a week we are having. Um, we are having a confluence session next Saturday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time and 11 a.m. Central Time, uh, 10 a.m. California time. It's going to be a humdinger because I'm not sure how many artists I have to talk yet.
Hmm.
But um, what I do know is that I have Lana Shaheen to talk. And she is the Palestinian woman that we've worked with for many years. And I've known her since she was 15, believe it or not. And she has done some extremely powerful paintings. Uh, Only two. She's done two paintings since she's been back in Qatar, but they're extremely powerful about what's going on in the world today, um, between Israel and Palestine. And it's really going to be worth people's time to hear what she has to say. Um,
Nice.
so, I just urge everyone to come and hear her. It'll be an amazing day. Uh, and I couldn't even talk to Tim about it yesterday without weeping when I was trying to prepare him for it. Um, so anyway, we are in the midst of this essay from this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, Volume 1 by Murray Stein and Thomas Arst. There are 5 volumes. It's a very powerful collection when you read it. And this particular essay, by synchronicity, is bang on what we're facing right now in our election. And it's about the reality of evil. Evil exists, and it's about each of us and how we all contribute to it. And so we're not pointing fingers at any one person because we're all in it. And that's what we have to understand. So we stopped last week at the beginning of a section that talks about volume 10 of the collected works. These are essays by Jung called Civilization in Transition. And we are still in the midst of this. He wrote most of these essays in the 1930s, and we are still experiencing it today because before the 20th century, the world was pretty much checkerboard split up among countries. There were many, many, many different countries, and even the United States is the United States. So each state actually represented a country, is a country. Each one is a political sovereign in the sense of nation states. And we call it the United States because we came together to um, be stronger as a nation. And but many states go their own way on all kinds of topics, as we know.
But
And
it's interesting that it kind of oscillates between an oligarchy and a republic.
right,
50 oligarchies and one republic. I mean, so, or 51 Puerto Rico. So, um, and that's the nation state piece that unites into the United States of America. So,
yeah, and the District of Columbia.
well, yeah, okay, yeah, that one too.
So, in any case, we do have Americans who are not allowed to vote, who are not represented in Congress. These are the Puerto Ricans and the citizens of the District of Columbia, our capital city. If you live in the District of Columbia, you don't have a senator. You do not have a representative. Uh, we have people who represent their interests in Congress, in the Senate and the Congress, but they have no vote. And so um, it's really an odd situation. I mean, if you look at DC license plates, they say on them taxation without representation because they're taxed as American citizens, but they aren't represented in the Congress. So anyway, there are lots of issues and always have been in the United States, but before it was pretty clear who a German was, who an Italian was, who a Spaniard was, um, who an Irishman was. And in the 16th century, that began to break down somewhat. And by the 20th century, it was full on uh, broken down. Sorry, I have some sort of sound behind me. Wondering if I have a mouse or something. I don't think so, but who knows? Okay. Um, so anyway, now Europe with the European Union has really become a federated republic too, very much like the United States. I mean, there's a European Parliament uh, and European um, leaders who are not from a nation state per se. You can, for at least the last 60 years, in my experience, um, you could load a truck in Spain or Italy or Greece and drive it all the way through, um, all the way to Sweden and Finland without ever opening it up, without ever passing customs. And whereas in the United States we slowly gave up our toll booths, the nation states slowly gave up their immigration among the states of Europe. Um, and so the world has become kind of a conglomerate, and that causes lots of dislocations in attitude. And
And to me,
so with that preface, go ahead, Jordan, your
I
turn
was
to
going to
talk.
say that's a great preface, because I think what's interesting too is um, we need to make one of the points of evil is don't get too comfortable with what you expect, um, because I think one of the evils is death while still alive,
Yeah.
and the system, for example, the European Union, it came together, but it's also coming apart. You get the UK leaves, push comes to shove, Poland will just walk right out. They don't care about getting fined $300 million for not letting immigrants in. They just are sitting tight. And so, I mean, Poland is a kind of an example, I think, of the verge point of watching a system that's alive undergo change.
Yeah.
And I don't know which way they go, but they don't care about the fines. They care
Well,
about
and
their integrity,
yeah,
and that's
and
important.
the Russian-Ukrainian war is a part of this, obviously.
Right.
In our lifetime, the Soviet Union was very, very tight at the beginning, and all neighbors were all thinking on their neighbors. They were all uh, telling the government, "Oh, my neighbor did this," and then that gets somebody in trouble, et cetera, et cetera. And um, and we've gone to a time where Russia is a much smaller country and now has an economy about the size of Italy, and people refer to Russia as a, a gas station with nuclear weapons.
Well, it's interesting because the thinking part you mentioned, Dr. Jordan Peterson said, during the lockdown, he just watched his neighbors itching to turn people in.
Mhm.
And I think that um, is interesting. Where left to people's own devices, you'll see it's kind of like the hits the fan, except in a very slow, quiet, silent way.
Yeah,
And you start to see how people respond under intense pressures, and appearance versus reality, how big Russia is versus the density. There's a size, but then
right.
what's the density in that whole volume? And I also see the kind of weather report in the world. I mean, look at the UN and NATO starting to attempt to move on the chessboard to become the government of governments, this new
Yeah,
world order thing, which is, I think it's a bunch of focus. You're not going to absorb all these countries into some allegedly peaceful oneness. Um,
not for a very long time.
yeah, I mean, this is not human nature. I mean, it's like you
Right.
can't even rule a neighborhood, much less every country in the world. I mean,
Yeah,
it's just
very
it's
much so.
unwieldy. It's
Right.
unwieldy.
Very much so. All right. So I'm asking our followers today and the people who listen later on video to just consider where you are, how evil you two are in these words, and you'll start to understand what our predicament is. And it's a predicament we're all in. So all right, so I'm going to read on. I'm on page 199 of this essay, which is, as I said, in Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under
Before
Postmodern
before
Conditions. Go
before we
ahead.
start, here's a question. I've been wrestling with this over the last week of what is evil, and we understand from the movies and The Exorcist and all that. I mean, but in regards to this, it exists within us. How is that natural and healthy, or how is that what strengthens the good to fight against it? And I'm kind of torn as to what evil is, because there's a quote from Jung. He said, the presence of evil exists in society when people aren't allowed to tell their stories. And in that concept, the evil is you become so closed and dense that there's no breathing room inside. You start to get compost and sewage inside. You start to blacken inside. Every time you open up to say something, it's mean or cruel, which is then weak because you haven't worked outside with your stories. So there's a human nature piece that's simply compression and neglect and incarceration in self that generates evil, versus is there some standalone psychopathic, born and from day one they're just trying to harm everything around them from that's their whole modus operandi statement. So
Well, there are some people like that, but we all contain some. And I I guess the issue is that it can surprise you in various ways, and I certainly acknowledge this from my life experience. And it's like the yin and yang of the Chinese philosophy. Um, you know, it's the opposite of good. And if you think you're good, then you would do something that's really awful.
Well,
Right?
actually, that brings to mind to me a really I hadn't thought about this way before, but a crystal clear example of evil that I had. And in a sense, I had it because it was in context.
Mhm.
So I was 19 years old. I was invited to be as a voting member. I was still in college in architecture, invited to be a voting member on the design review committee for a new fellowship hall facility we were going to build in our church. And, I'm honored. I'm 19. I'm in college. This is a huge thing. So that's celebratory.
Sorry, we lost you for a few moments, and all we had was you were in college, and we missed the
Okay.
rest. So
I
could you
was in
repeat it?
college. I was 19. I was invited to be a voting member on the Fellowship Hall Design Review Committee meeting for a Fellowship Hall facility we were going to build.
Hmm.
And as an architecture student, I was honored.
Hmm.
Well, here's the thing: hubris, naivete, easily taunted, easily fooled.
Hmm.
So I didn't know the why of why I had been put there. I thought it was because, I'm really kicking butt in college and
Hmm.
I'm in architecture and I'm gonna be a leader and all this, and I'm 19. And that tells you the whole story right there. I'm
Yeah.
19. Ask me when I was 19 because I knew everything then. Well, what's interesting is I'm going through this celebratory piece. I'm trying to do my best design review job, impartial, look at different things coming up. Well, lo and behold, the architecture firm that I worked for was the front runner for the competition.
Uh,
I didn't know this because it hadn't been distributed inside the firm yet. It was one of those. The firm I work for was one of the primary ecclesiastical structure architects in Texas. Well, so that should have kind of put off a red flag.
mhm.
But then I remember my dad and stepmother saying, "Well, you do know that your boss is going to be competing for that." And I said, "Well,
Yeah.
but I'll be impartial. I can do the right thing." And now I look at that and go, "Oh boy, that's the reverse of they doth protest too much." That I actually
Right.
said that is enough to say, you need to leave. But at 19, I didn't understand conflict of interest. I didn't really understand betrayal.
Right.
But and they were trying to get me to resign from, recuse myself from the committee and all this. And that was all kind of, why are you trying to take away my accomplishment or my
Yeah.
potential accomplishment? This is wonderful for my, here you go, resume. who cares? You know,
Right.
DGAF, it's not impressing anyone, except who are you trying to strive for? But then my boss at the first meeting walks into the room. And when he sees me sitting there in chair number 2,
Mhm.
voting position, I mean, I just saw livid, mean, warring,
Mhm.
betrayed, evil in a way,
Mhm.
except I immediately had this sinking feeling of what have I done? But then immediately it comes to me, his best friend had been sitting in the window sill at every previous meeting. Why didn't anyone tell me? Why
Yeah.
didn't he tell my boss?
Yeah.
So there was, and then I realized the head of design review committee still had a grudge against my dad from some high school football bullshit.
Oh boy.
And my dad didn't give a rat's and didn't even think about it. So you get this immature little boy who's a huge businessman in the
Yeah.
city who put me on this because since my dad wouldn't pay attention to him, he's going to pick on the little 19-year-old.
Hmm.
But what happened is I'm going along in this celebratory moment, this accomplishment driven piece. And then right when I see his eyes, I have now committed evil. I have just betrayed my first mentor. You know, the next morning, of course, I was fired. And, but I look at that now and I see even with the best of intentions, in context, I did not see from experience what my accomplishment was doing to anyone else. And then obviously, you know, I smell conflict of interest from 10 miles away now. But it's interesting that in that sense, then I had, because I've been searching, you know, where is any evil in me? And I realized it was foisted upon me by context, but then my actions mean I have to take responsibility for that which was foisted upon me for my error of omission.
Yeah.
And I was evil towards my first mentor, which I hadn't thought about it that way, but actually it's pretty helpful because I've already, you know, processed all that. But now I have I have a very dispassionate look at it where, okay, that happened. I don't need to go back and, you know, grovel to myself or anyone. I mean, it's
Right.
so gone, but
Right. Okay. So let's read on with Liliana Wabha, and she's a Brazilian Jungian analyst, and we did interview her a couple of years back. So you can find her interview with us on the Wisdom Path uh, collection. So I'll begin to read. In particular, the essays contained in Volume 10 of the collected works, Civilization in Transition, and In Answer to Job, Jung reflects on the valence of evil in the psyche, in society, and even rooted in religions. The Second World War left its painful mark on thinkers of the time, and Jung witnessed the devastation of two terrible wars in the 20th century. On several occasions, he expressed his deep concern for the future of humanity. Murray Stein, in his extensive review of Jung's work on the subject of evil, explores the meaning that Jung lends to evil. He shows that Jung understood how energy is manifested in the psyche and in nature in terms of cycles of structuring and dissolution. The question posed refers to the intrinsic nature of the unconscious and the archetypal reality of evil. According to Stein, Jung pursues a psychological vision of evil, adopting such notions as shadow, complexes, projection, and possession of the ego, all of which in some measure annul the capacity of moral discernment. Okay, I want to reread that last phrase, all of which annul the capacity of moral discernment. On the one hand, Jung
Actually,
understood. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm glad you stopped there because even my example, the external forces, but then they're my responsibility in context once put on valence of evil in the psyche.
Mhm.
That what comes to mind is electrons orbiting valence shells.
Yeah,
They are not what they are orbiting, but they are in context orbiting. So in that sense, my first mentor was orbiting, and so were the other two gentlemen. I use that term loosely. Um, in my context. So they are a valence of evil. And then, this is so apropos, um, annul the capacity of moral discernment. No
mhm.
matter my best intentions, there was no way for me to discern that I was about to be in trouble. So, in a sense, surprise attack from valence of evil in the psyche rather than me being evil.
Right,
And me not being evil then makes it to where I have an incapacity to understand that it's even present. In that sense, I'm blind to it.
right. Okay, so going on the one hand, Jung understood evil as the product of consciousness rather than as having substance of its own, whether in terms of a psychic, physical, or metaphysical nature. Accordingly, good and evil would be poles of contrasting discrimination used to differentiate experience, as well as a prerequisite for refining moral judgment by cognitive means. In other words, evil would not be intrinsic to human nature. On the other hand, however, by proposing the incarnation of the dark side of God and evil contained in the duality of the divine essence, and consequently in that of human beings, evil would be an intrinsic nature. Stein claims that Jung admitted the paradoxical nature of this contradiction. We lack an answer. That is to say, we shall remain at a loss as to whether evil springs from the shadow uh, and is a product of archetypal possession and inflation, and if it is a judgment of consciousness or a reality in itself. But that, be that as it may, the effects of evil are always real, and some individuals seem endowed with intrinsic badness. Perhaps a scrutinizing consciousness and not just reason provides the appropriate vaccine or the antibiotic available to us, whether to face the evil that is in us or else to increase our chances of being protected from what is alien to us and often insoluble. Yeah, I just want to stop there for a minute because um, just I don't think anybody in the post Roe period can say that some of the consequences to young women um, by not having the right to abortion have been um, have been truly evil, and especially when doctors in Texas have been asked to just let a woman bleed out um, until she's near death, and then they can give her medical help, which is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous concept, but there are many people who think that. Now, on the other hand, there's no denying that um, an abortion without the need for a medical procedure, um, just a whimsical abortion, it too is an evil. And the question is, do we decide um, which side of the question of evil do we decide that issue on? That it seems to me that's the point that all of us can see evil in the other side, whatever it is, and uh, and it seems to me that this is not a question that should be decided by governments. It has to be decided by each individual. Um,
Yeah, I think because there's if I look at two logical arguments, one being okay, in the course of rape or incest, of course, yes, that's just out of hand.
yeah,
But then, of course, then the next, well, only in the first trimester. Well, then that starts to discern, what is life, what is cognizance, what is consciousness, all that. But I think the real elephant evil in the room is making decisions about women's bodies. That is, they're not little girls.
yeah,
And if they are little girls and they're pregnant, well, then okay, foist it upon them most likely. But I think the biggest evil is the hidden one of why are we even discussing this?
yeah,
And I think that why are we even discussing this? I would say needs to stopgap of. I think there should be just as many rules about women's bodies as there are men's, and that number is exactly zero.
yeah.
And
Well,
I think
and maybe these discussions should be had, but I know that men are singularly inappropriate to be discussing it.
we can't
It's
give
not,
life. So what
yeah,
business do we have actually understanding? Because, for example, in context, in group discussions, I think it's interesting that a lot of men don't understand that when they use the word stillborn, they have a definition for it. And when a woman has the word stillborn, that's an emotion. And I think understanding that men do not innately understand, they have to learn to defer and get the perspective from someone who can have that occur, which is a woman, is more important, I think, because you get a lot of men making decisions. Well, is that just about power and
yeah. I don't think we can
fear?
get down to value judgments about more important or less important. Uh, I'm trying to get to the issue of what is evil, and my point here is that both sides are evil. And if you're young and you don't remember a couple of movies that were came out, I guess, in the late 60s or 70s. One was In the Heat of the Night, and the other was Dirty Dancing. And in those cases, which is before abortion was allowed, before that came up before Roe v. Wade, um, it was pretty evil. Okay, it was pretty awful. And the estimate was that about 15% of all doctors in the country were committing felonies every day. And there were still lots and lots of abortions. I have a classmate who um, has been married 5 times, twice to the same woman in one case. So he's married one woman twice, but three other women that he was married to, and he organized some other women to have 3 abortions. And he described to me once the issues of riding up and down the East Coast looking for a doctor that would be willing to um, do an abortion when we were in college, which wasn't even something I was remotely thinking about when I was in college. And so, you know, things were pretty stupid. Uh, and we're just getting this current issue right now. It's just giving us a new dose of it in a different way. Uh, and I
It's
suppose it'll come up again in 30 or 40 years. I expect
what
it to be resolved soon, but
It's interesting to me in context, then, the Jung quote of evil is present in the world when people aren't allowed to tell their stories. Then the evil that men specifically do is making laws about what women can do, and that incarcerates their story and
Right.
takes their sovereignty and their individual choice, decision, and will, free will. It doesn't take it away, but it locks it up, binds the hands, so to speak.
Right.
And then you get the type of woman who then takes that and stops and accepts that. And then you get the wonderful kind of woman who's a vigilante and says, get out of my room. I mean,
Yeah.
take Ann Richards, who brings a double barrel shotgun to a meeting.
Yeah.
That's her pointer. Okay, your turn to
Yeah.
talk, and it's loaded.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah. So State of Awakening says in chat here, if the government is going to criminalize abortion, then they should also be held accountable for creating laws and norms that promote a culture that does not propagate the over-sexualization of women. And of course, we had that from the church in the last 2 millennia until the 20th century came along and people started to question God, I would say, and question their faith in various ways. And so because the church, regardless of what religion you follow, always is trying to promote a cultural rule of some sort. And when the purchase, the grip on the psyche of the followers started to be lost, that's why we're so confused today. And
well, we're adolescents. We've come out of the ecclesiastical structure, and now it's our hero's journey, so to speak, to live our
right,
own.
and so we have to relive it ourselves because, hey, sex is fun. Who doubts
Go
it?
figure. Go
Right.
figure. And
Yeah.
why
And
demonize the good stuff? And I think what's
right.
interesting too with that, if I scale up the incarcerated, not able to tell your story version of evil,
Yeah.
then more laws make more criminals.
Mhm.
And I think what's interesting is when we implement moral judgment through law,
Yeah.
then honestly, I look at people and say, well, you know, do you need those laws to tell you actually not to even do those things?
Yeah.
I mean, and that in that sense, then from a morality standpoint, I find with some people, if you need morals, then you're just a bad person on a leash,
Yeah.
And the reality is, okay, maybe that's the point of the laws, to restrict bad behavior. But what's interesting is instead of being led by a community or a congregation, the community and congregation of self is the true leader, and how to know to navigate. And I will go back to my example, the naivete with an annulled sense of moral discernment. I walk in, I'm all bright and shiny, and then I'm just kapow,
Right.
crushed.
So I'm using this issue just to point out that regardless of what position you're taking,
Yeah.
the other side, you view the other side as evil and the
Yeah.
existence of evil in that case. And there's just no discussing it. You just
Well, and I'm glad you brought it up that way, because I think then what you're saying too, instead of the us versus them, it's more Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks' concept, cultural dignity in difference.
yeah.
Teach me about your way that I don't agree with. And that's, I think, the source seed of getting your head around evil in a
Yeah,
way
well,
that,
I don't choose to be taught their way. In other words, I have one daughter and son-in-law who are very much, intransigently against abortion under any circumstances. And uh, we had a we had an argument about this one time, the two of them against me, for about an hour. And at the end of it, I'd simply said, well, we simply cannot discuss this in the family. And again, because um, if we do, it will destroy the family and it will destroy our relationship. And, we just have to let people go their own way and find their own truth. And
I think
and I
though
think
that
society right now is getting a snootful of younger people who have been born since Roe v. Wade, uh, starting to get a snootful of um, what came before. And
hmm
these things are never done. And so, regardless if this becomes settled law in the next couple of years, it's going to come up again because there will be approximately half the population that has the opposite point of view. So let me go on though, so that we can get through this essay. Okay, so knowing and exploring the depths of the psyche as he did, Jung understood that ingenuousness in the part of scientists and psychologists was unconscionable, and that an attitude of confrontation was necessary. Indeed, indeed, even indispensable to cope with the destructive forces rooted in the human psyche. In Answer to Job, written in 1952, Jung warned about the scope of the power of destruction given to man and the necessity to temper his will with the spirit of love and wisdom. And boy, do we see that in our controls on nuclear weapons. I mean, as I was growing up, I think most of us expected that a nuclear weapon would be used again at post Nagasaki. And so far, um, the leaders who have control of these things realize that, God, I wish I didn't have these. I wish I didn't have these in the closet. It's like you know, buying a weapon and realizing that that weapon uh, is an instrument of evil potentially. And it's like having a hot coal in your household. Um,
well, your
because
family example is ideal because your the family's will with the spirit of love and wisdom was implemented by we can't talk about this anymore or the family will come apart. You basically had the satchel,
yeah,
the suitcase with the nuclear codes,
absolutely.
and you made sure we're not going to open this suitcase. We're not even going to
Yeah,
access the codes. This will destroy the family. So what's interesting is, the whole abortion under no circumstance that foists predeterminism on people so that they just have to succumb to any kind of circumstances, which goes back to my betrayal example of, okay, it's on me, but what can I do about it? Except you're saying, no, let's stop this. This is not going to tear the family apart, which then your wisdom there is completely counter to my naivete back in 19. You saw forward.
yeah.
The general
And
who sees further.
yeah, and Jung himself in one of these essays um, said, you have to watch the generals; they'll want to pull the trigger. Uh, and
Yeah.
and to their great credit, on all sides, nobody has done as yet. And I understand there was an issue during the Ukraine-Russia war, which is ongoing, where Putin threatened to use what they call tactical nuclear weapons. And, Biden just told him, no, you cannot do that, because if you do that, then we have to do it. And
Yeah, and that's
and one
action
thing
reaction.
leads, pardon?
That's action reaction then.
Right,
And
right.
it
And we
the
do
momentum
train
development.
we do train officers to use tactical nukes. When I was in the artillery school in 1969, we had we would mark a target like this on a makeup uh, artillery exercise in red. If you marked it in red, that means it was a target for a tactical nuke. And we have them in our arsenal. Russia has them in their arsenal. I think many others have them now. And we just cannot use them. And all of us as human beings have to walk away from that. And, it's like, it's like, you think you need to buy a weapon to protect your family, but uh, once you have the weapon in the house, you realize it's like having a hot coal in the house. And oh, by the way, um, chances are you wouldn't be able to get to it when you needed it anyway.
Yeah, and keeping them locked and unloaded. Well, then they're just like a vase of flowers. And it's like,
right. That's exactly
you know
right.
what I mean? I do hit you over the head with oh, I hope there's full of water.
Right.
But I think what's interesting here is your family example and the suitcase with the codes. Betrayal can only come from within. And so what happened is you precluded internal betrayal in the family from
Yeah.
occurring from that one disagreement.
Mm-hmm.
And I think then what I've never thought about it this way before, but then utilizing a tactical or full nuke, that's betrayal of the community of the world.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is that's like inner city or gang violence where, instead of solving this, it's hold up the gun and pull the trigger. And I shot you first. That means I'm right.
Yeah.
Except it doesn't mean they're right. They just took power, except they took it, honestly, an easy way out. It reminds me of loopy loopy romance movies where someone says, I would die for you. I'm like, no, 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 that's a cop out. You only have to do it once. And then you leave me with all this grief and you're
Yeah.
gone and I'm
Right.
alone. And why don't you live with instead of die for? But then, like Patton
But
said,
some people have to be prepared for that in order for there to be a deterrent
that's true.
on behalf of our leaders. And so I've lived this my entire life. I've carried a military ID card since I was 10 years old. I still have one in my pocket right now. And there's a rule which says nobody wants to fight a war, but somebody has to know how. And and
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, that's the definition. That's the whole misunderstanding of the scripture. The meek shall inherit the earth, because the meek, people think, oh, that means weak and cowed down, but just because the way the word sounds,
yeah,
the true meaning, if you source it back, meek is, I might as well be a samurai warrior, a ninja.
right,
The meek is, I walk through town with my sword sheathed. And it comes back around to, I'd rather be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. And the meek part is dangerous, able to do all those things, yet consciously and voluntarily, it's not even under control. It's just
yeah,
not a thing unless it's necessary. But if it comes to bear, the sword comes out.
Well, and it isn't even an issue of owning a weapon yourself, because the reality is that if society were to start to come apart, there would be weapons everywhere and available everywhere.
Hmm.
Somebody, let's say my neighbor, for reasons that I would be against, decides that he's going to do something with a weapon. Well, good chance he might get himself killed. And when he does, there's his weapon on the ground. You
Right.
can pick it up and use it. You don't need to buy one. Right? And and the chances are that even if you have one, you can't get to it in time to use it in any given situation. I mean,
Well,
I always
yeah.
think of the case of the woman of Gabby Giffords, and when she was shot by somebody, and um, there was a fellow that had a loaded pistol on his hip in a liquor store that was right behind Gabby Giffords, and he comes roaring out of the liquor store, but he left his weapon in his holster. Why? Because if he had drawn it, very good chance he would have been shot by the police. Very
Right.
good
They
chance
would,
of it.
because at that point they don't know who's participating.
Yeah. And so, your weapon is not useful. Meaning carrying a weapon doesn't make you useful. It makes you a target.
But
Right.
it can very much so, and I
Right.
think it's so funny. The whole attitude in a lot of the South
Right.
um, is a wonderful weapon. Where here's my doormat, and it says our doors are not locked to protect us; they're locked to protect you. If you enter, I hope you know Jesus, because if you don't, you're just about to meet you know. So I mean, it's that
Yeah.
thing. I mean, it's like where I think the attitude that the holstered gun, that's an example of meek, because he was going outside to protect, but he made sure he stayed alive by keeping. He's not unsnapped. Basically, is the
Yeah.
term.
Yeah. I mean, if you draw your weapon, be ready because somebody's going to get you.
Well,
Um,
I remember at a friend of mine got stopped for speeding, and I just looked over and I said, "Officer, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but you're unsnapped. Is there more here?" And I put my hands up on the dashboard. I said, "Because you're unsnapped makes me very uncomfortable, and I want you to see I'm not moving, and she's not moving." And he said, "Oh, it must have happened when I got out of it." So he snapped it back. But the thing is, me noticing that one piece was we're potentially in a lot of danger here.
yeah, absolutely.
Or it's an
Um,
impersonation because he doesn't, someone impersonating a police officer might not know that an unsnapped gun from the holster, it that's a clear signal.
yeah. All right. So we have to go on if we're going to finish this today.
Yeah.
Um,
There's
okay.
a lot.
What were you going to say?
There's just a lot in here that applies. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think we have to be
Okay,
more
so
vigilant with this
since his
data.
early personal experiences with the unconscious that resulted in his red book, the problematic of evil is present in Jung's work and receives thorough scrutiny. We shall refer to some important passages of this matter later. For the present, let us look at how Jung warns us about what has been described above, whenever we are dealing with a state or attitude of innocence, pseudo-innocence, convenience, or childishness, infantile cowardice, be it neurotic or merely opportunistic. In Flying Saucers, that's the name of a Jung essay. So in Flying Saucers, Jung describes the risk of a naive and unconscious person who could imagine avoiding sin as a childish illusion when the danger of succumbing to evil is stronger by remaining unaware of it quote, unconsciousness is no excuse, but is far rather a transgression in the literal sense of the word. Like other thinkers of his era, including Freud, Jung was preoccupied with the fanaticism and mental servility of large, undifferentiated groups dominated by unilateral premises. In extreme cases, this would lead to sociopathic leaders, as emphasized by Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Quote, regimes in which the totalitarian tendency is to make human beings superfluous, redundant, and indispensable and dispensable as individuals. Since the subject cannot be prevented from thinking, his thinking is made impotent and irrelevant, as if his individuality has dissolved and all men have become one man, an undifferentiated mankind. By exerting pressure on everyone and turning each one against the other, total terror destroys the space between them and becomes a condition of a perfect totalitarian government. When radical evil emerges in connection with a system in which all men have become equally superfluous. And we very clearly see this in the assumptions that our former president makes in this election. He has subsumed everyone who was against him into his pattern over the last 4 years. So there's nobody that's willing to stand up to him, or very few in this day and age. And so therefore it needs to be controlled, or we're going to be in real trouble. Okay,
Well,
so
and I think
go ahead.
again, as I've said over and over the last several months, I backed out of my previous political decisions and became a capital O observer.
Mm-hmm.
And even going back to the debate, he was fact checked 6 times. They missed 18. That's a total of 24.
Mm-hmm.
They fact checked her 0, and there were 26. So I would put them dead on equal as to, it's not definitely lies, but it's omissions, which are a different kind of lie. And it means they're just pushing their agenda. Now, at that point, there is an us and them that injects itself, but does someone answer with specifics, or does someone deflect? And I think what's interesting is we're seeing the absolute fractured difference of the political system that we had even 20 years ago. And this whole piece is, if I look at what's the last line in that, become equally superfluous. It reminds me of Mark Twain. If voting really mattered, they wouldn't let us do it. And, and the kind of thing where then a lot of people get hot and bothered, red or blue, about the other color. And even purple these days doesn't mean squat. So I think right now, George Orwell wrote several books about what we are directly experiencing.
Yeah.
So I think that the blindness of both sides is evidently present to me throughout history. And right now we're getting a big dose.
Yeah, the Pennsylvania Dutch have a penalty which is called shunning, where if you don't do something right, you can be dismissed from the society. And we have one side, and we're not going to get into this further, but we have one side in this election that uses shunning very clearly and explicitly, and one side that doesn't. And
respectfully, I disagree. They're both shunning the other. They're both shunning. And here's the thing, they're both shunning instead of only talking their policy. I only see mudslinging. And it's
Mm.
interesting to me, that's shunning both ways. And then one side is always holier than thou than the other. And I think hypocritically it applies to both. And I think that's our lesson. How can we
Well,
make
and so the lesson is, even in this conversation, we have a difference of opinion. And
exactly?
the point is that everybody, that means you who are listening to this today, has got to go make their own judgment. You have to make your own judgment, not only about this, but about everything that you hear from somebody else, whether it's in your church, in your community, in your school, what have you. You have to make the judgment. You cannot allow yourself to be subsumed under the collective. If you do, then you're giving up your agency 100%.
I think speaking of the agency, there's a big one I've noticed recently. There's a fake article that RFK won a judgment at the appellate level of the Supreme Court against all the pharmaceutical companies. It's not true. And it's written almost like a legal brief in an article so that it appears like some, oh my Lord, look at this. You go start looking. It's not even there, much less won. And so I think we have to fact check what we see. And in some senses lately, I've been saying, well, that makes too much sense to be worth a darn. So I better go check it out.
Yeah. Well, Kathy says we could learn to fight fair, so to speak. And I disagree with that, Kathy, because we have to learn not to fight.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
We
that's
have
bringing
to,
a knife to a gunfight. It's like,
yeah. I mean, we have to learn not to fight. And we have to learn to see the other person's point of view and find the best answer for humanity. That's what we have to do. And
I
yeah,
think
go ahead.
responding to Kathy there, I remember a Navy SEAL that was at my table several years ago, and um, this really goes into the fight fair thing, and also the meek, which means your sword is sheathed. And once the fight starts, there is no fair. All's fair in love and war. Once you start a fight, there are no rules. There just
Yeah,
aren't, and it's
right.
then life and death. But he said something that was really really interesting to me. He said, if you're threatening me, if you're taunting me, one, I'm not afraid. And if you want to fight, I can just run. Last thing I want to do is slam you on the concrete and get sued for $1 million. This, that, and the other. You talk, you talk, you talk. It's cheap. I'm not going to do anything. But if you touch me, your life will forever be changed. And
Well,
that's that was
this is the same position that Biden spoke to Putin about. Do not
right,
use tactical nuclear
right.
weapons. It will not it will not end well for the Soviet Union or for Russia. It will not end well for Russia. It won't end well for us either. But that's the point.
I think
Okay.
if I quickly respond, I think that Kathy's intent, though, instead of fight fair, I think it's discuss fair. So I think we discuss fair,
Yeah.
but once the fight starts, there is no fair. So I think the fair in discussion is important. But if you think about chess, the black and the white pieces are mortal enemies, but they're wielded by usually best friends. So that's
Right. And we used to talk about grok, and we have to grok everything. And grok is more than understanding. You can look at Robert Heinlein's book, A Stranger in a Strange Land, about a person that went to Mars, I guess, and then came back. And he had learned from aliens that you have to grok someone in order to fully appreciate them. And it's an impossible task. His book spends, 300 pages defining the term grok. And so, yes, Kathy, I agree that it relates to hush me, but at the same time, um, we all have to be hushed. We all have to make our own judgments, and so we can try to present points of view. But we have to be continent. Let's put it that way. We have to be
That's
continent, right?
that's perfect way to put it. Because
And
if you're incontinent, you're usually sensationalist. You're spewing everywhere.
right.
Whereas if you're continent, you can mute yourself and not be so sensationalist. And I think that's the discernment part that you hit the nail on the head. That's the discernment part. The
Well,
ability
and
to self-mute.
right, and so they teach Marine officers idea of Clausewitz, von Clausewitz, um, which is that war is diplomacy by other means. Okay, well, yes, and so, but the old saw still remains. Nobody wants to fight a war, but somebody needs to know how. And so we need to be the tip of the spear, but the tip of the spear should be sheathed, right?
Mhm.
And everybody should, you know, if somebody has a silly opinion, whatever it may be, um, we have to let them have that opinion and move on. We can do other things. I mean, I have a passably good relationship with my daughter, with whom I don't agree on religious matters. Um, but it's not that I disagree with her so much. It's just that I have a broader view of what religion is trying to do than she does. At least I think I do. Um, and maybe I don't. But I have to allow for both possibilities in order to keep my relationship with my daughter and my grandsons. And so I do that. I don't. I'm not the crazy old uncle that comes to Christmas dinner and starts to spout things. Okay,
Well,
I have to
and
avoid
it's
being that.
that bigger picture. You're the person who has not separated the philosophers from the warriors. Where when you do separate them, your laws are made by fools and your wars are fought by cowards.
Yeah,
And I think that's an important piece. Back to the suitcase piece, your stopgap of I am going to protect this family. And you made a law, and it's a law of omission. We're not going to talk about this. That will hit a kink in the hull, and we don't
yeah,
need to deal with that weakness.
right. All right, so reading on. This phenomenon, however, does not occur only in situations of terror or totalitarian oppression. It frequently appears too in democratic concepts when conscious or unconscious dominating and subjugating forms of behavior is habitual. Kant's notion of minority applies to the so-called mass mentality in relationships characterized by subjugation. And quote, enlightenment is the human being's emergence from his self-incurred minority, unquote. Due to laziness and cowardice, so many people remain minor under other guardians and do not take the trouble to assume their responsibilities. Here, the presupposition is that the direction exercised by another, whether by an imposing force or by free acceptance, reduces the capacity of full awareness of oneself and the surrounding world. The state of innocence would thus be one of the variables on a scale when the individual, without anyone identified as his director, remains at the mercy of actions or projections that he fails to perceive. In this regard, in The Undiscovered Self, that's a book by Jung, and if you haven't read it, you should read it. The Undiscovered Self, it's an important book, and it can be read in an afternoon. Jung refers to a society composed of de-individualized human beings, a rents one man, completely at the mercy of ruthless dictators. He also points to the unrealistic and infantile dream state of the mass man slipping back into the kingdom of childhood, into the paradise of parental care, into happy-go-luckiness and irresponsibility. In short, in this work, he reflects on the tremendous importance of self-knowledge and responsibility with regard to actually being capable of harming oneself and others, and the importance of recognizing humanity's black collective shadow. Quote, in fact, this negligence is the best means of making him an instrument of evil. Harmlessness and naivete are as little helpful as it would be for a cholera patient and those in his vicinity to remain unconscious of the contagiousness of the disease. What is even worse, our lack of insight deprives us of the capacity to deal with evil, unquote. I'm going to read that paragraph again so that you can try to understand what he's saying about cholera. Quote, in fact, this negligence is the best means of making him an instrument of evil. Harmlessness and naivete are as little helpful as it would be for a cholera patient and those in his vicinity to remain unconscious of the contagiousness of the disease. What is even worse, our lack of insight deprives us of the capacity to deal with evil, unquote. I'm going to stop for a minute and just comment that what he's saying is that you can't just say, I'm going to leave it to somebody else. I'm going to follow this somebody else's rule.
Right.
You have to make the rule. Okay. You have to make the rule. You can be informed by somebody else's rule, but you have to make your own rule. That's the thing. Because if you defer to the pastor or the political leader or the military guy, whatever it is, you're giving up your responsibility, and you're all responsible. Everybody's responsible. So
you just hit the nail on the head of my observer. I pulled out, the most difficult thing is I pulled out of a red-blue football game and I'm watching everything like a hawk. And it's not that I don't have decisions, but I realized that whole, everyone's de-individualized. If I hop on and pom-poms, rah, rah, pep rally, blue, red, purple, pink, whatever. Well, I'm going along with the flow, and only dead fish go with the flow. And so my thought here, my most difficult piece is usually I haven't had to be alone. Usually I have a group. And I have just kept quiet and listened and watched. And it's amazing when I actually stopped oh, that makes sense. Oh, I agree with that. Where I have to see it several times for it to become a decision precedent. It's interesting because it feels like we're in that 1984 de-individualized place, and evil is present.
yeah.
And there's a lot of irony And then there's a lot of straight out, it is what it is, and so it's a difficult time. And I think it's even more difficult when you pull your head out of it and watch it and realize, oh my,
Yeah.
hell in a handbasket.
Yep. Okay, let's go on. In this text, Jung uses the term imagination for evil, and it is the Red Book that he inserts vivid pictures and visions to represent this imaginary power that raises the strangest figures from the depths of the psyche, figures known to poets, artists, and philosophers, and leave no doubt as to the horror that dwells within us. He gives the name, quote, spirit of the depths, unquote, to what stands against the spirit of the time, and proclaims, what I speak is the greatness and intoxication and ugliness of madness. Here, Jung prepares us for the disturbing visions that follow and paves the ground of the imagination for evil referred to above. The crudeness of some of these visions raises criticism and suspicion concerning the mental health of the author, who nevertheless made it clear that the work was an experiment, my most difficult experiment, unquote. An opening to the unconscious gathered through intuitions to be confronted with consciousness. Paul Bishop refers to the aesthetics of unacceptably horrendous and repulsive, with shocking passages and portraits of death, somewhat comparable to spiritual exercises designed to contemplate death. In Jung's view, the fantasies described there are to be read symbolically rather than literally. That is to say, that a hermeneutic treatment of creative fantasies that accepts the irrational as a psychological factor. The revelation of the unconscious should be understood from a scientific and ethical stance. In the introduction to the Red Book, Shamdasani points out some themes from the work that he sees as an attempt to understand the individual's relationship with the social and as an effort to understand subjectivity itself. He underscores the fact that Jung realized the contemporary malaise of spiritual alienation and dealt with the atrocities of war, manifestations of madness, and religious transformation or transformations. Carrie Baines remarks that Jung told her that he had no respect for inspired ideas that had no impact on reality, which confirms his psychological philosophy of elucidating psychic phenomena and his desire to institute a psychological education for the individual in modern times. According to Yaffe, the unconsciousness of human beings and their submergence in a quite irresponsible mass disturbed Jung deeply, and he foresaw catastrophes threatening the existence of the human species. With apprehension, he saw the dangers which arise when the truth of the depths is not recognized, its darkness, neither endured nor enlightened. If the paradox of the essence of evil may be in Jung's work often interpreted by the shadow, in other words, by pointing to the differentiation of consciousness, and as we have seen, leaving evil in itself unresolved. In the Red Book, the phenomenology of evil appears substantial, even haunting the author himself. What follows is a selection of quotations, the better to appreciate Jung's thinking in the Red Book. With regard to his preoccupation with man's aggressiveness toward his fellow men, see the description written between the wars. as well as what Freud wrote in 1930. Quote, "No one should be astonished that men are so far removed from one another that they cannot understand one another, that they wage war and kill one another. One should be much more surprised that men believe that they are close, understand one another, and love one another. Two things are yet to be discovered. The first is the infinite gulf that separates us from one another. The second is the bridge that could connect us. Have you considered how much unsuspected animality human company makes possible? Um, Men are not gentle creatures who want to be loved, who at the most can defend themselves if they are attacked. They are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. As a result, their neighbor is for them not only a potential helper or sexual object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture, and to kill him, unquote. Accordingly, if evil is inevitable and inherent in human nature, all we can do is to confront it as Jung incites us to do after observing that abysmal evil may come from man's stupidity and unconsciousness. One of the toughest roots of all evil is unconsciousness, unquote. Now, um,
Yeah,
yeah, what I want to emphasize here is when he's talking about consciousness, he's not talking about, oh, I'm conscious that I'm hungry right now and I want to have have something to eat. Uh, you know, anybody over the age of 2 can have that much consciousness. The consciousness he's talking about is a much more global consciousness that we need to understand and be aware of. And so,
Mhm.
in a sense, my decision about the Vietnam War, that I wanted to go there because I wanted to understand why it was wrong, um, is seeking that kind of consciousness. Okay, not just accepting what almost everyone, I mean, 95% of my generation, um, tried to prevent the war in one way or not another, or tried to prevent themselves from having to go to the war, who objected to the war. And my instinct was that it was wrong right from the beginning, and my father backed that up by his teaching to me. But still, I wanted to go because I didn't think that what I was hearing from the the conscientious objectors was correct. I didn't think that they had the right answer either. And sure enough, I confirmed my opinion established in 1962 that it was wrong, but I also found out why it was wrong, and to my satisfaction. And I don't care what anybody else thinks. I was an instrument of the U.S. government during that time. And so I had a duty to perform. Yes, indeed, that's true. And what we did was evil. I acknowledge that as true. And yet, um, each of us has to educate ourselves about what is right and what is wrong. Now, I'll turn it over to you.
I think the example there is the lesson you saw that you already knew that your dad aptly showed you of the warships going out.
Yeah,
And it was several years prior. And because the generals have to make rank, and they can't make rank if there's no war.
yeah,
And in a sense, it's a military business decision for career advancement, but
right.
at the expense of the people who are literally being advanced over. So
Yeah,
I think that right there is the whole seeing behind the scenes is the exact bigger picture contrast to me at 19, not able to have had the experience to see behind the scenes. And then I learned the hard way. Instead of Abraham Lincoln, your dad gave you the Abraham Lincoln way of, hey, learn from other people's mistakes because you don't have time to make them all yourself.
yeah, right.
You know,
Right.
and that was one mistake I had to learn by making it myself. And I made a wonderfully thought through career decision that ended up being the worst thing I could have ever done then. But long term, it certainly gave me a whole lot more than I even, bargained for.
Yeah.
So
And so Penelope says she's here and she says, let's see, I think we are all in the soup. And of course, um, for them that knows the way that Jung would greet a new patient was always, so you're in the soup too.
yeah, so you're in the soup too. Yeah, like nice, different way to say nice to meet you.
Yeah, right. So yeah, we're all in the soup. And whether we know it or not, it's best to know it. Okay.
I think one simple quote for us, because the family suitcase, see bigger picture, protect the family. You saw what was not there, and you weren't going to allow that to be there. And in a sense, the quote there is just because I take a spoonful of ocean and there are no sharks in the spoon doesn't mean there are no sharks in the ocean. And did it cut off? Did it cut off?
Jordan, we met, you cut off. So,
Yeah, your suitcase example with their family. I mean,
right,
you saw what wasn't there, but you knew it was there and you precluded it. But that's the quote would be just because I put a spoon in the ocean, and I look at the ocean in the spoon, and there are no sharks in the spoon, I should not declare that there are no sharks in the ocean. And
right,
you looked there and you did that. And honestly, that's the general, that's the long view, the admiral, the commodore,
right.
seeing not just quick fix now, the strategy of how these steps we all take in the soup are going to mushroom in
Yeah,
society.
yeah. And I happen to be thinking about the Marine Corps. And I think of the fact that it almost, I mean, our former president got enamored with the idea that the nickname of one of the Marine generals was Mad Dog. Okay. And so he thought he would be a fighter, fighter, fighter. But that general, Mattis, um, was like a gentleman monk, okay, or a warrior monk, okay. But our former president, because of his lack of service, didn't understand that people who think of the stereotype of the Marine Corps don't understand it at all because I never saw any Marine at all higher than the rank of major that I could describe as Mad Dog. Okay, there was one who um, I would describe as a mad dog guy, okay, who thought we ought to just go out and kill everybody, right? And let's just fight, 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 and be a mad dog type thing. I knew one. Um, and I guess he was a lieutenant colonel, but he's the only one at the lieutenant colonel rank. And all the others that I ever saw in my career and my life experience, because I've been around the Marines my whole life, um, was was a monk, a warrior monk. And I know any number of people that say they'd rather have a Marine with them than anybody else. And it's because we don't we don't keep those people. They aren't in the Marine Corps. Although, in common parlance, most people who think of the Marines think of us as mad dog warriors, but that's not the case at all. Not at all. And
There's a lack of reactionary there in the Marines, which is interesting to me because it goes with Sun Tzu, Art of War. And instead of being reactionary, the leader, self-led, each and every one, never interrupt an enemy while they're making a mistake. So you just sit there and watch. And that is a piece of strategy rather than mad dog, kill, kill, kill. And I think that strategy is very much at the on the ground, literally level with Marines. From what I've learned too, to confirm that from your experience and the ones that I know, I'd call them the Zen farmers. The hole's too deep. Well, stop digging. There's a strategy there where they're not like, oh, well, let me solve this. It's like, stop digging. I mean, so that's a strategy, and it's a bigger picture and a little tiny example, but not just run in willy nilly. I mean, there is no willy nilly. I mean,
and some people think this about Al Gray, General Al Gray, who became commandant of the Marine Corps, and during the Vietnam War, he'd go out into battle with a cigar and the whole image type thing. But when he came back and started to go up in ranks to the point where he became commandant, he insisted that the Marine Corps is a fighting force. And so he insisted that we all be infantry first, which is what the Marine Corps has always been, actually. Okay, there's nobody in the Marine Corps that doesn't know how to fire a weapon. Even the piccolo player in the Marine band.
And these days, the piccolo might be a gun.
Yeah, and so he insisted on warfighting skills because that's what the Marine Corps is, as the tip of the spear. But he did not insist on that as a willy-nilly thing. He only insisted on it as a training thing, and so that everybody understands the purpose. Because the Marine Corps, man, you do not want to mess with the Marine Corps, because the Marine Corps, among other things, has the 10th largest air force in the world. And we have tanks, and we have artillery pieces, and we learn how to put red tick marks on the map. And if we're going into a fight, we're going in, and we're going in heavy. We're not the airborne. Okay, airborne, if they go in, Army Airborne, they're very brave people, and the Rangers and so on. But if they go in jumping into a battle zone, they're only good for 2 days. If they're not resupplied within 2 days, they're in trouble. And there's a great movie called A Bridge Too Far, which is a perfect testimony to that, where um, where Montgomery insisted on dropping a bunch of paratroopers into Holland, which was occupied by the Germans, and it was a kind of disaster. Um, and but when you call the Marine Corps, wherever it is in the world, we're going to come with everything. We're ready, right? And so you don't mess with the Marines. Okay, it's simple. Now, if you want to fight a theater level war like World War II, yes, then that's the Army, right? But if you're going to attack an island in the Pacific, you're going to do it with the Marines. And we come with our own F-18s. Marine Corps are naval aviators, so they fly off carriers too, just the same as the Navy guys do. And we like them because um, they understand what it means to give close air support. But anyway, all right, going on. So we have to understand the evil, what's evil and what isn't evil, because the mad dog idea sounds like it's evil, sounds like it's strength without thinking, but that's not what the Marines think it is.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's all warriors in the garden, no gardeners in the war.
Yeah. And every colonel that I ever met, or every colonel or general officer, was a gentleman first, as far as I was concerned, no doubt. Okay, so accordingly, if evil is inevitable and inherent in human nature, all we can do is to confront it, as Jung incites us to do after observing that abysmal evil can come from man's stupidity and unconsciousness. Quote, one of the toughest roots of all evil is unconsciousness, unquote. The Red Book contains several passages where the author now adopts a dialogue tone with the reader, and then a superior affirmative rhetoric as spokesman of this spirit of the depths. What message does this convey? What it transpires is the constitution of polarities of the ego, the necessity to renew and adjust consciousness, and to confront the shadowy, destructive tendencies, but mainly to acknowledge that evil is absolutely real, although we cannot understand it fully, for evil always eludes us. In other words, the thinker, the psychiatrist, seems to be warning us that any interpretation, like shadow or possession, will be partial and limited, and yet, even so, it is up to us to face the task. And by us, he means you, everybody, or she means that. In perusing this coming and going of fantasies, some of which are hermetic and incomprehensible, what one sees delineated is an almost a manual on how to confront evil without succumbing to it. The author exhorts human beings to see themselves in their moral shortcomings and to realize the ambiguity of virtues. The almost prophetic tone of his words carries us to other realms that defy understanding. Vivid images are used, such as, did you know what evil is? And inevitable substance, unsuspecting messenger, the serpent hisses, the bloodthirsty tiger. And then going on, quote, did you ever think of the evil in you? Oh, you spoke of it, you mentioned it, and you confessed it smilingly as a general human vice or a recurring misunderstanding. But did you know what evil is, and that it stands precisely right behind your virtues? That it is also your virtues themselves as their inevitable substance? You smile innocently, my friend. Don't you think that a gentle flickering of your eye betrays the frightfulness whose unsuspecting messenger you are? Your bloodthirsty tiger growls softly. Your poisonous serpent hisses secretly, while you, conscious only of your goodness, offer your human hand to me in greeting, quote, unquote. We're shown that recurrent supports can be useless when faced with such mighty opposition, including blind confidence in faith. The illusion that makes us place ourselves in the hands of a benevolent facilitator God is dispelled as a help to combat human destructivity. Quote, the eye of the Godhead is blind. The one eye of the Godhead is blind. The one ear of the Godhead is deaf. The order of its being is crossed by chaos. So be patient with the crippledness of the world and do not overvalue its consummate beauty. Unquote. That's at the end of chapter 1 of the Red Book, if you haven't read it. And if we are deeply disturbed by the injunction, assimilate the dark God who also wants to become man, we are somewhat relieved when Jung also asserts that evil is necessary, equivalent here to destruction, in order to dissolve and renew established formations. Quote, you will need evil to dissolve your formation and free yourself from the power of what has been, unquote. He then endeavors to orient us by announcing that, paradoxically, the infernal condition of the psyche, enveloped as it is to darkness, or I guess it's by darkness and horror. Sorry, didn't read that word. Enveloped as it is in darkness and horror, can only be shed by confronting evil rather than denying it. Quote, he who does not want evil will have no chance to save his soul from hell. So long as he remains in the light of the upper world, he will become a shadow of himself, unquote. Note that hell is followed by a very striking hermetic part that is difficult to understand and assimilate. The sacrificial murder, quote unquote, that's the title of a chapter of the Red Book, in which a mutilated girl has her liver devoured by the protagonist at the request of the soul, symbolizes the sacrifice of the divine child and the soul's need for atonement. The innocent murdered child becomes divine after eating the liver. Each and every man is to blame for the horrors committed by men and women, I have to add. Each and every man has to expiate and to feel remorse, the liver metaphor. In other words, our sense of ethical responsibility extends beyond the personal to the collective. We remain neither in innocence nor sin, just responsive to our deeds, be they virtuous or malicious, as well as acknowledging the deeds committed throughout history. Consider the crude, quote, abominable, unquote, description. We can understand Jung's doubts about the publication reported by Carrie Baines, who feared jeopardizing his position as a scientist and respect as a human being, seeing as the book could be considered sheer lunacy. Finally, after traveling the sinuous and irrational paths of fantasy and its intriguing and complicated metaphors, the warning message against evil and the ineffective attempt to ignore it seems coherent enough and in line with Jung's observation on the individual and collective psyche. The wisdom of the psychologist and humanist scientist is revealed here in the attempt to reach out to his and future generations, not only in a rational manner, by clarifying prophylactic measures to draw our attention, since as an analyst, he was aware that words of advice did not work by themselves. He therefore endeavored to transmit the message through the unconscious, a message that he hoped would echo in each one so as to avoid extreme destructiveness, cruelty, barbaric oppression, and annihilation, escape through death when life loses meaning, and also in order to avoid naivety and denial. The quotation below closes this essay. The notion of desire for evil that we bear within us is one of the strangest paradoxes of our consciousness, defying as it does all ethical sense. In rereading these lines, they strike us in a profound and defiant manner, inciting us to offer unique answers to a universal reality. It is not a question of surrender. That would be intolerable, but rather of an unconscious appropriation as a form of confrontation. What remains to be questioned is the feasibility of extending this individual confrontation to the collective. And here's the last paragraph, quote, "You suffer from evil because you love it secretly and are unaware of your love. You wish to escape your predicament and you begin to hate evil. And once more, you are bound to evil through your hate, since whether you love it or hate it, it makes no difference. You are bound to evil. Evil is to be accepted. What we want remains in our hands. What we do not want, and yet is stronger than us, sweeps us away, and we cannot stop it without damaging ourselves, for our force remains in evil. Thus, we probably have to accept our evil without love and hate, recognizing that it exists and must have its share in life. In doing so, we can deprive it of the power it has to overwhelm us." Okay, Jordan.
I'm just really enjoying this last piece, trying to stay in the both and paradoxical thinking place where, this goes through evil is not bad here, and nature is neither good nor bad. And the bloodthirsty tiger, that's a human personification. It's not an evil thing, that's just nature. And I think what's interesting here, the uncommon appropriation as a form of confrontation, that's nature has no rules. Nature has no order. Nature just is. It's not mad. It's not happy, sad, angry. It has no malice. It is creative and destructive. And what happens here is, I think in the paradoxical thinking, I just have never been able to source the evil within. I'm not a forbidden fruit kind of sin person. I'm like, nah, it's just hiding the good stuff. So like Lilith, any woman worth demonizing is worth getting to know a heck of a lot better. And, and it's the kind of thing to me where the whole do not comply comes in. But what came to me here is substituting the word destruction for evil and creation for good. And then I realized in the garden, the evil is me weeding, except I'm weeding for the good, to remove the bad to get more breathing room for the good stuff. But it's still valence shells of evil. The weeds are outside of myself. And so it's interesting. I think this is one of the most complex ingoing exercises, is to actually be able to sit down and say, where is my evil? Because if I say I have none, that's just some spiritual elitism, holier than thou, self-righteous crapola, and that's just me not being strong enough to be honest and see it. Now, I can be ignorant enough to not see it, and I think
Yeah.
naive enough to not see it, because I keep that example when I was 19. But if I scale that up, utilize the example of your family in that suitcase where you're not allowing the destruction, then I start to realize maybe my evil is not of concern to me. Maybe I live my life in such a way that I don't get all hubris, settled down too easy. Everything's fine. All problems are solved. It's like, okay, if that's the case, the trouble's really about to begin. So, it's like I'm interested. I'm just really, as we've gotten into this, I think again, I'm glad I kind of went into political observer, because here I've been week after week shedding my expectations. With I look at some people, like Gabor Mate said, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And I think that that's the suitcase in your family,
Yeah.
So the opposite of not talking about that isn't talking about it, it's the renewed larger scale family. So I think right now I'm settling in, as we kind of close this chapter here, to substitute destruction for evil and creation for good, knowing that that means I still have not really wrapped my head around good and evil, because I'm still substituting, which is that hermeneutic, the
Well,
presumption of
and you're forgiven for
interpretation.
that. Right in this essay, you're forgiven for that. We can
Yeah,
never understand evil. Okay.
exactly. And I
And
think understanding that I don't understand gives me a comprehension that, frankly, I don't need to waste an iota of time on it. But
yeah,
it's a sandbox, though, that I think helps me inspect what I expect, because expectations are then blind spots. And that's
yeah,
you seeing further as as a lieutenant colonel than making some mad dog, quip decision, quip crack decision. It's very thoughtful at the level of strategy. And I guess
yeah,
that Navy SEAL comes back to mind. He said, he goes, we study and we have to accept the mission before they tell us what the mission is. So there's the not knowing.
yeah.
You're on board. You accept the mission. Now you study the mission, you plan the mission, you strategize everything. He said, we are Cirque du Soleil level gymnasts in what we are going to do. And guess what? No plane has ever survived first contact. And I said, well, why do you spend so much time with something that's futile and it's going to go away? He said, because the highly prepared mind can easily work off script. So all of that consolidating, collecting self, facts, lay of the land, maps, even kind of thing, where they get there, doesn't matter what happens. They can easily, the prepared mind can easily work off script. And
Mhm.
that made so much sense then about comfortable with the not knowing, but actionably getting things done daily.
Yeah,
So I think there's a whole, I'm really lately, I'm glad you brought up the Marine piece too, because the military examples are, sometimes their reasons are completely unreasonable, except then you realize, well, but look what they did. So the reasonable is the solution after, not the rationale during. So there's a whole process piece artistically, even. I think I've been enjoying looking at different leaders and how things went about. And you get a lot of vigilantes basically who are in context. So there's a lot of hearts in the system.
yeah,
So anyway,
yeah.
2 cents.
So, I think of my best friend in life, man who I've known since 1962, who um, whose father was a 30-year man in the Navy. And when I knew him most was when we were in high school, and his father was the staff secretary to the commander of Naval Forces Japan. And in our junior year of college, about the time I was joining the Marines, he departed for Canada and is still there. Um, and he lives at the northernmost tip of Vancouver Island. Um, and I never, he was always my friend. Okay. He was always my friend. And he did amazing things in life. I feel like I've done amazing things in life, no, not the least of which is this YouTube channel. But he did amazing things in his life too. and 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 I still communicate with him and his wife almost daily, if not daily, to this day. I lost him for 30 years because I lost contact with him before we had cell phones and easy communication, which is what happened to friendships in the old days. You'd lose contact with somebody and that would be it. But now you can be in contact with almost everybody. Okay, I was looking at a list of my classmates from college this morning before I came over here. And, most of those guys I could still be in touch with.
Mhm.
Okay. But, the fact is, they never understood me. They never did understand me. Um, and I don't know if I understand them. Guess I think I do. But they thought I was the biggest fascist going when I joined the Marines during our junior year of college, um, and yet, and they were all way left of me at that time. I was the uh, reactionary fascist as far as they were concerned. And today, I consider myself the second most liberal member of the class. There is one other who is more liberal than me, um, who very clearly is more liberal than me.
Funny you say
But,
that.
huh?
It's funny you say that because I remember in college, right at the end of my thesis, when the book The Temple and Man was dropped on my desk, and my thesis had been The Temple and Man, a house for
Mhm.
myself,
Yeah.
thinking it was original. You know, they knew, and they. I think they kept the book in the library checked out all the time. So even if I went there, it was always gone,
Mhm.
and I would probably start to disbelieve it even existed. But I never did. But I'm surprised. But um, I remember coming then across R.A. Schwaller de Lubisch, like Rene, I don't know what the A stands for anymore, Schwaller de Lubisch, who wrote The Temple and Man, and then a big 2 volume set, The Temple of Man. And it was one of the it was just as pivotal as Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which was also dumped on my desk at the exact same time. And um, I laugh because then I start to do a little history afterwards, and then I'm looking at the Yugoslav architect Jose Plejnik, and then all of a sudden I realize R.A. Schwaller de Lubisch was a fascist, and I'm like,
Mhm.
oh well, I can't like his work anymore. And then I went, no, I love his work. His
Yeah.
politics are none of my business. And when I said his politics are none of my business, I realized that now I start to look back, and there was a whole, is it liberal and conservative or is it liberal and fascist? or is it fascist and fascist, but they're differently fascist? And then socialism is the only problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. So
Right.
it's the whole, actually going back to your business to MBA, 13 courses about stats with different titles, and follow the money. Is it always about economics? And then, oh, what kind of fascism did I accept by omission, by liking this work, or I didn't because I carved it out? So it's
Well,
interesting.
one thing I want to urge upon you and all of our listeners is um, forgive yourself. Okay. Nothing changes. And I didn't know I was writing it at the time, but basically, um, when I was a senior in college, I had to write a dissertation, uh, and um, and I had no idea what I was going to write on. But it was back in the time of Mao Zedong and the Red Guard movement in China and so on. And my main professor was an Asian expert. And so I happened to be in the airport and I saw the Little Red Book by Mao Zedong. And I decided I was going to write something about that. And I opened it up on that particular flight. I don't know what flight I was taking, but anyway, I remember it being in Washington National Airport where I was. And I picked up the Little Red Book, and I had been studying Confucius and um, and Taoism during college, and I said to myself, "My God, this sounds a lot like Confucius and Taoism." And so I wrote my essay, 100 and some page essay, where I simply compared statements of Lao Tzu and others to Mao Zedong, and they're identical. They are almost identical. And I just had quote, quote, quote going down the page for most of that essay with a little bit of connecting tissue. And and I just pointed out that nothing has changed.
It's funny you did that because I remember 2020 2020. It was right, actually, fall of 2020. Actually, when you and I met, I
Mhm,
found I had just moved off of what I was doing in Philly and was in that 6 month process where I'm going to come here,
mhm,
and um, or year process ish. Um, but on my desk where I could see them both. I had The Art of Peace by Morihei Ueshiba, he's the founder of Aikido, and The Art
mhm,
of War by Sun Tzu.
mhm.
And I would read a paragraph of one and a paragraph of the other, and a paragraph of one and a paragraph of the other. And later I realized it wasn't in order, but each one had the paradoxical Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers dance counterpart that was not at odds. They were in
Mhm.
a tussle of, if you didn't have both, you had nothing.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's like, this is saying the exact same thing.
You could have gotten an A plus at Hamilton College.
Yeah, there you go. And it was like the whole comparative piece of, instead
Yeah.
of, oh, this is source material for this and back and forth, finding two historical friends that are saying the exact opposite thing.
Right.
And you realize they're not saying the exact opposite thing at all.
Yeah. And yeah, and that's the amazing thing. So, uh, to our audience, be good to yourself.
Yeah.
When when we have our election in 2 weeks, we're having it ongoing because a lot of people are voting early, including me. But um, when the results come out, regardless of what they are, the world will not end. Enantiodromia is forever powerful. That is the Greek concept of the tendency of things to become their opposite. And and so if the side that you want to win doesn't, I assure you this too will change. And we are in a process of digesting, I would say, the consequences of the end of the power of the church, okay, and all religion. Um,
And a mundane point, check your voter registration status.
yeah,
I
check that.
had the thought last week. I don't know why it came to mind, but when something like that comes to mind, I went, that's stupid. I've always renewed it when I renew my driver's
Yeah,
license. And so I went on the voter registration site and clicked in my info and went to, and it's like, I didn't exist.
yeah,
And so note that
and
they've been purging duplicates, and there's a lot of people who were dead who are no longer obviously allowed to vote because they're dead. But realize the system is imperfect, but it's probably not a conspiracy. It's just do your due diligence to make sure that you have your vote and it can count.
right. And Maryland's system of mail-in voting is really terrific because uh, we could go to a Dropbox, which we did, and within a day or two, um, I get a notice from the Board of Elections saying your vote has been received,
Right.
and your vote will be counted, or
Yeah.
something to that
There you go.
effect. And so I already know that my vote is in and that it will be counted, right? And I don't know how you can get better than that.
Well, yeah, and also the early voting stuff. I mean, the find out where your
Yeah.
polling location is, and you don't need to go wait in a long line at the last minute. I mean, it's
Yeah. So anyway, don't despair if the guys whoever you want to win, loses, because this too will change. And, we are in a big collective digested period. It's probably, I mean, Jung, I guess, thought it was going to take 600 years, because he was talking about religion, but it may take even longer than that. But, we things will change, and, we each have to live our lives. And, um, one of the interesting things is, we're having a session in our advanced reading group this week about the chapter in the Red Book entitled Divine Folly. And in that, Jung points out that, um, you cannot live a life which is a imitation of Christ. You have to live as Christ lived. You can't imitate him. You have to uh, live your own life as best you can. Um,
well, and I think that there's also take things sometimes literally. The whole "I am the way, the truth, and the light." Take that personally. Be the
mhm.
way, be the light, be the truth. That way, you're not imitating. It's your divinity, and I think that will help connect better to what's there instead of handing over yourself. And I think
Absolutely.
then you take responsibility that you're not playing the Christian victim.
Yeah,
I have to,
whatever you're doing, be the best at
yeah,
it.
yeah. And if you're not making mistakes, you're not doing
Yeah,
anything.
you're not trying hard enough.
Yeah. So
That's
yeah.
one rule I always have.
And people are always like, well, how do you feel? You don't feel bad about the mistakes you made. I said, well, I didn't harm anybody. I made shame walk the plank so I can keep making mistakes. my job is to be able to make mistakes I can usually afford, and then that means I can grow. But sometimes I make mistakes that I can't afford. And also, here's a good self-deprecating example. This is what, 2 months ago now, 3 months ago, Jordan, what is the stupidest thing you've ever done? And I just started laughing, and I said, I think it's pretty presumptuous to think I've peaked. And I thought about it, and I went, I better be really careful for the next 48 hours, because, and I don't mean careful being full of care. I mean being a little cautious, kind of careful. The next morning, I'm making eggs, and as I'm moving them around, and one of the chunks of the scrambled eggs went over the edge of the pan and down to the gas burner. Well, so when I finished, I took the pan and set it over on the other burner, and I'm consciously looking, but the 4-year-old me, oh, look, it's just a black metal burner over so black isn't hot. It would be red hot if it's hot. I literally turned off the gas and almost watched myself. I picked up the metal grate. It's hot. I mean, this is
sure.
And the thing is, I didn't throw it down. I remember saying, don't damage the range top. And I slowly put it down. I got 2nd-degree burns on my thumb and my index finger.
Oh, gosh.
It took like 6 weeks. And then I stopped and went, I told myself to be careful yesterday and to watch for an aloofness. And that naivete was right there. And anyway, so give yourself some credit and, forgive yourself.
Right. So next week, we're going to talk about an essay entitled Movements of the Soul in the Red Book. So we're going to talk about movements of the soul. And we're watching the collective movement of our national soul in the next 3 weeks. So peace. Take care, everyone.